But in the meantime, let me introduce our first panel looking at the theory of liberalism in America. Our first speaker today will be Mark Blitz. Mark is the Fletcher Jones Professor of Political Philosophy at the Claremont Graduate College, where he also directs the Salvatore Center for the Study of Individual Freedom in the Modern World. He's a fellow at the Claremont Institute and author of many books, including 2005's Duty Bound: Responsibility in American Political Life. Our second speaker will be Jim Caesar. Jim is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Harry F. Byrd Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia, where he also directs a program, the Program for Constitutionalism and Democracy. And he, too, is the author of several books, including 2010's Designing a Polity. And then finally, our third speaker will be Bill Kristol. Bill is the Weekly Standard's co-founder and now editor-at-large. In 1983, he co-founded the Center for American Political Studies at Harvard's Department of Government, and today he serves as a director for the Foundation for Constitutional Government. You may have seen his video series, Conversations with Bill Kristol. I'm glad to have this opportunity for a conversation of my own with Bill Kristol and also with Jim Caesar and Mark Blitz. So Mark, would you start?
Thanks, Adam, and thanks to all of you for coming. I was asked to discuss the theoretical origins of American liberalism before we then turn to things more practical, I suppose. I've got 10 minutes, so I'll mention 10 origins. And saying a few words about those origins is my first main purpose. My second main purpose is to suggest that mistakes in understanding or falling away from these origins is one major cause of our current difficulties. And a second major cause is tendencies in these origins themselves. So some of our decline is endemic, but the pace and speed of it is not. And the decline can be challenged by remembering the worth of the origins. So to the 10 origins. First, although the American liberal republic is modern, meaning post-1500, post-Machiavelli, some of its roots are classical or ancient. There's no liberal republic without natural rights, and there are no natural rights without the classic discovery of nature and of natural justice. And the fullest liberalism, or the fullest freedom, is the free use of the mind that bows internally to no authority, something that the classics discovered. Ignoring or forgetting this true ground of freedom is a cause of our current, often silly, petty, but also often dangerous misuse of our liberty, and also of our forgetting our excellence. Second origin of American liberalism is our grounding in rationally defensible, equal natural rights. Not the only truth about human beings, but a truth nonetheless that applies to all of us. Equal rights are not a tribal, ethnic, historical, geographical, or gendered opinion or imposition. Rather, they're universal. Falling away from this origin in equal natural rights is a major cause of our forgetting the only true ground of equality and turning instead to our current combination of mere group and individual assertion and mistakes about how both limited equality and limited inequality can be justified. But it's also true that equal rights or liberty have their own tendency to become or to favor mere license and equality simply in all things. The third theoretical origin is to understand human happiness as the satisfaction of desire, where desires are largely equal, where satisfaction means pleasure, and where pleasure means the relief from unease. And one can look to John Locke or to Thomas Jefferson for this. As opposed to what? As opposed to seeing happiness as the excellent use of human abilities, virtue of soul, ethical and intellectual. The falling away is that the satisfaction of desire is increasingly equated with the lowest, most ordinary, effortless, physical common denominator with fewer and fewer publicly accepted restraints. But happiness seen as satisfaction of desire has its own tendency toward this leveling. The fourth theoretical origin of American liberalism is to substitute toleration for piety as the reigning religious virtue. Over time, religious differences become less salient politically, and religious observance becomes increasingly private. The correlative negative internal tendency is that religion becomes less significant overall, with the occasional reemergence of religious purity or piety. The current falling away from our origins is the attack on religion simply and the views that stem from it. Neither too much nor too little public importance for religion is a very hard balance to keep. The fifth origin of American liberalism is the importance of activity within institutions. One could compare Plato and Aristotle with Locke to see this, and the result for us is separation of powers. The correlative endemic negative tendency is excessive faith in the mechanical operation of institutions at the expense of judgment and character. The current falling away from our origins is downplaying the importance of institutional and constitutional forms altogether. The sixth theoretical origin concerns virtue and character. Our root in equal desire and institutional mechanisms leads us to downplay the importance of virtue and character. These seemed connected to the aristocratic inequality and to the religious moralism that we revolted against. The concurrent internal difficulty is the tendency to ignore or take for granted the importance of character in assuring the basic trust on which the community depends. So, virtues such as responsibility, industriousness, civility, and toleration are not taught sufficiently. Today's falling away from our origins is that the very merit and desirability of character is either doubted relativistically or mocked as belonging only to one race or group. The seventh theoretical origin of modern American liberalism is the importance of law, of explicit statutory law, rather than customary practices and character. The concurrent internal difficulty is the tendency to make all relations legal ones, which leads to excessive legalism at the expense of common sense and decency. Today's falling away is the growth, even within this legalism, of arbitrariness and inequality in the actual conduct of the legal system. The eighth theoretical origin of American liberal democracy is our emphasis, at least compared to anything historical, on the acceptability of acquisition, of accumulation, and of wealth. This is obviously connected to equal natural rights and to happiness understood as the satisfaction of desire. The correlative internal negative tendency is that the excessive importance of wealth drives out other goods and concerns. But the falling away today is to forget that the expansion of economic value relies on free markets and capitalism, and to believe that wealth comes automatically or somehow drops from the sky. The ninth theoretical origin of American liberalism is the simultaneous growth and dispersion and limitation of power across the community. The obvious example of the growth of power is entrepreneurial and even corporate activity, largely but not exclusively economic. This activity provides a useful outlet for what are primarily the political passions of ambition, pride, and competition. The correlative internal difficulty is inattention to political life directly among some of those with talent, and insufficient talent directed toward it. The falling away today is to forget the contribution of these entrepreneurial activities to freedom and to limited government, and not only to wealth. And today, as well as earlier, without enforced competition, power has a tendency on its own toward concentration and inequality. The 10th theoretical origin of American liberal democracy concerns science and enlightenment, technology, the conquest of nature. This is useful for creating wealth and for satisfying desires. It fits with our other origins. The correlative internal difficulty is the tendency, especially present today, to want to overcome all human limits and differences, as well as all the other natural limits. The falling away today is sometimes to forget technology's utility, leading to atavistic limitation, example, excessive environmentalism, and perhaps even in the long run to military weakness. Now, technology stems from science, and science stems from philosophy, and philosophy rests on the discovery of nature. So that lets me conclude by bringing me back to the original item on my list. Today's difficulties in liberalism stem from a combination of forgetting what is good in our origins, but also harmful tendencies in these origins themselves. Thank you.
The issues that Adam asked us to address is Madisonian liberalism in trouble today? Is it worth saving? Which, of course, suggests a deep threat to liberal democracy. And I suppose since this is a panel on theory, we don't have to ask only will liberal democracy survive, but the question, should liberal democracy survive? Is it worthwhile? Does it produce a good way of life? So those are our two questions, and I want to concentrate on those, avoiding all possible things in Washington today to somehow engage in reductio ad Trumpem, which means that everything has to discuss Donald Trump. I'll try and limit it just to a few things about Donald Trump, if that's possible. And since, of course, this is being live streamed to thousands of students at the University of Virginia, I do want to point out, just in passing, but it's still important, that this idea that we have a Madisonian liberal democracy established in 1787 is only, say, half true. That was an aspiration of Madison, but in fact, perhaps because the founders could do no other, they didn't fully establish liberal democracy in the United States, but only in half of the United States. The other half did not follow the strictures of liberalism, nor the ideas of political economy of liberalism, producing slavery, which lasted all the way through 3/4 of a century, and really much longer still. So you could say liberal democracy, as we have it, was an aspiration of the founders. Now, what about this debate where it really begins on the merits of liberal democracy? I think the proper point to begin is with the progressives at the turn of the 20th century. They're a group that has the same name today as progressives, so there's a continuity between them. And this group, from the beginning, including thinkers like Woodrow Wilson and John Dewey, but mainstream leaders of progressivism. They attacked openly the structure of Madisonian liberalism, and they attacked the ends and goals of liberalism. So it was said that this sort of liberalism we have was okay for the 18th century, but completely out of place for the 20th century. So the question of the structure of government, from Wilson's point of view, you had to end the separation of powers, favoring an executive-headed system, an executive who would head a large government stuffed by experts, so kind of administrative agencies, who would write regulations, and this would be the normal way of governing. Later progressives then added the idea that the courts should be involved in adjudicating matters of culture. So this then became our essence of American politics according to the progressive view, a strong executive connected to public opinion, with an administrative state and a judiciary, and a Congress much reduced, separation of powers eliminated. For the aims or ends of government, here the progressives attack the old idea of liberalism that it should really protect property as one of the fundamental goals or aims. That might have been okay for the 18th century, but said the progressives, it was impossible for the 20th century. Property had to be conceived in a more collective way, redistributed or changed, but certainly didn't have the sanctimony that it's assigned in original liberalism. So you could say by the time you get to the conclusions of progressivism, that breaking from the original Constitution is in the progressives' DNA. It's part of how they think, and it's part of how they have thought for over a whole century. But when they say they break from Madisonian liberal democracy, they also go on to say that what they reproduce is something much better. Another kind of, let's say, democracy, not necessarily liberal, but another kind of democracy which is far better than the Madisonian system. It's not always specified exactly what it will consist of, but that becomes the end or goal of the American political system, according to the progressives. So where are we today on this in 2018? The Constitution has not been formally amended or changed in a fundamental way, but the system has been greatly altered. In structure, the legislative branch has turned over massive amounts of power to bureaucratic agencies, which now control lots of American politics through writing regulations. And when that hasn't been enough, executives have simply taken power on their own. They've written regulations without any basis in legislation by Congress, and without any idea that this legislation would be necessary. Many examples found in the Obama administration, DACA being such an example, or executives who just said that they're not going to enforce laws that they don't like. So it's an incredible move beyond the idea of law. Now, Trump has been praised by Republicans for eliminating, quite legally, I think, under current terms, massive amounts of regulations that formerly existed in all realms, in the field of environment, in the field of education. And this has been done, I think, quite in accord with the support of most Republicans, and in the idea that what can be made by bureaucracies can be unmade legally. Congress has not predictably, however, tried to take back powers that it once had and delegated to the presidency. So we see this in trade policy today, where many are upset at the direction the country is going in trade policies, but they're not quite ready to take the executive on. So progressives, who in principle would favor this shift in power, and did favor it to the executive, are a bit disturbed at the direction that it's not going, to say the least. They're only tactical supporters of Madisonian liberal democracy, not real ones. So we have in truth today, I think, a seriously altered Madisonian form of government. Enough perhaps to check a president, but hardly the one that Madison originally had in mind. Now, all this may be important, but it misses another really important and central point. Everyone realized that a political system to be maintained must have a public that believes in its norms and is prepared to defend it, to think that this is a correct or good system. So you'd say liberal democracy would be in trouble if people somehow no longer believe in the norms of liberalism and no longer practice those norms. And when you look around today, don't you see a lot of this? Aren't there people who simply, even if they have no alternative, seem to be attacking liberalism or very upset with liberalism itself? And it's obvious that when people disagree about, say, persons or policy, that at some point they find a way to attribute the problems that, and views that they oppose, they attribute that to liberalism itself. And to think that policy differences are sure signs of deviations from liberal democracy itself. So the more you get stress in the political system and polarization and differences of views, the more people are going to think that somehow this is the cause of liberal democracy itself. So when you look at where the populace is today, you have one side of the populace that despises to the point of obsession the person of the president. Everything he is and stands for is objectionable to them. And this spreads into every realm, even, say, the Blue Hen restaurant in Lexington, Virginia. Everything becomes political. And this redounds the idea that there's something wrong with liberalism itself. President Trump, on the other hand, is unduly disruptive, unpresidential, insulting of his opponents, stretching veracity at all times. He's in constant battle mode. Every day, 365/7 occupies the airwaves more than I think can be said of any president in the past, including Barack Obama at his highest moments. And this points out the fact that this thing we call liberal democracy doesn't merely depend upon its formal structures, but certain informal norms that go along with it that turn out to be very important. Things like presidentialism and what it means to be presidential has fallen by the wayside, and we see some of the consequences of this. So many people then blame the democratic system itself, beyond the president, beyond the policies. They see something wrong with the political system of liberal democracy. And the same is true with the policies people disagree on. Say immigration is a pretty big issue upon which people disagree, ranging from, on the one side, those who want to restrict the entry of illegal aliens and build a wall, to those on the other side who are de facto pretty much for open borders, or practically so. So each side tends to think that the other side has views that are not consonant with true democracy. So it's not only a question of a difference in policy, but people have come to the conclusion that democracy itself, liberal democracy itself, is at stake. That if you can't be a true liberal if you limit the number of people who want to come into the country. This becomes an issue of the political system itself, and vice versa. Of course, this is obviously false, given our true political system. The Madisonian governance would allow for both options legally to be undertaken, but people think less and less in those terms. Same with trade and tariffs. A lot of people begin to say, well, if you begin to impose tariffs, that's a limitation on free trade, and that's in direct contradiction with liberal democracy. Well, that's not so either. The United States allows for restrictions on trade and tariffs. We had it for decades in the 19th century. But again, this is attributed to liberal democracy. So this then becomes the problems. The difference in policies are regarded not just as differences of policies, but challenges to the character of liberal democracy itself. And when you look around today, one sees this everywhere in our politics for the moment, the time. Even in the norms that people develop in non-political zones. Take, for example, our universities. There, when you look around, you see there are many universities in which something like free speech, exchange of ideas among different parties, really isn't accepted by the students, and the administrators acquiesce in these policies. So that, say, one of the things that you would think would be characteristic of a liberal democracy, openness to exchange of ideas, is pretty much shut down as people are disinvited or not allowed to speak. Now, this would be legal in most cases. There's nothing wrong with private institutions simply saying we don't want to hear a certain point of view. Though it would be nice if they advertised that when people applied to colleges, like Scripps is a nice liberal system on the left, and we really won't accept speakers from the right here. Please come. But generally, there's a great deal of dissimulation that goes on. And I listen to students who, in some ways, simply don't recognize certain persons should have the right to vote or have their votes counted. Or at least their votes shouldn't count as much as the students' votes. Somewhat like John Stuart Mill's system, that if you go to some university with a lot of prestige, you should get 10 times the number of votes as the others. And they haven't quite figured out where they want to go, but it is remarkable to see that people who are considered by them deplorable, their votes simply should not count. And how you handle this is a problem for them, but the belief is spectacularly so. Or the use of things like economic boycotts to challenge political decisions. So people take a certain view on state takes a certain view on marriage before over a cabal, and you have large corporations coming in to try and pressure the state to change its views through saying we won't hold conferences here, we won't hold meetings here, and in fact using economic power to do what should be within the realm of the political. So this is a way in which more and more we see liberal democracy challenged in a vague but important way. And finally, in this view, I think we can mention the outcomes of the presidential election of 2016. At the end of the day, this presidential election still has not been decided. There are thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, that are still hoping that it will be reversed by some decision of a special prosecutor. So the hope remains alive that we will change the presidency, and that in a liberal democracy we can't even have true presidential elections that hold. Finally, if you look at academic writings today, I won't have time to do so, but if you look at them, you see speculative attacks on liberalism combined with vague or eschatological views of how liberalism in the future might undergo some profound change to some other form of system altogether. Now, when the left raises this question, it raises it in terms of economics, arguing that as we move into the future, and already, liberalism faces huge inequalities in wealth, fantastic differences that are only going greater and greater. And their argument is you cannot and you should not allow this to continue. Wealth will need to be further collectivized, in their view, with the hope that redistribution of wealth will, in a way, solve our problems. The right is more interesting in a way still. Society is producing more and more unhappy individuals, misdirected individuals, individuals who seem completely lost, individuals without restraints, a culture that's evidently declining. People are on a treadmill, and they can't seem to get off of it. We see this everywhere. Oh, someone respond by saying, well, that's just the problem of the culture, not liberalism. But liberalism, it's responded, is part of the culture. It forms our culture. It set up a certain sort of human being, an idea of what the human being is, that is now being fulfilled. So no one quite knows where things will finally go in this enterprise as we move into the future. It does seem true that it's time maybe to expect a good deal less of liberalism. I certainly expect less of liberal politics maybe than I originally did when I first read certain parts of Democracy in America, where there's so much to be said for liberalism, at least in its best phases, in hopes that the political would be something that would truly ennoble us. Liberalism depends in many ways on restraints, restraints that liberalism itself really, we see, doesn't produce, but liberalism may undermine them. So liberalism does destroy its own restraints, or so it seems today. That's one of the disconcerting things about it. Yet I do expect less of liberalism than I once did. But I think it's fair to say that that's probably a reasonable change of views. You should only expect so much for politics, especially if you have no alternative to put in its place.
Bill is very subtle behind his legal pad. He's actually been live tweeting the first two speakers. So, Bill, did you take any notes along the way? Do you have any
I did.
opening thoughts?
It's hard to be off Twitter for so long, but I'm doing my best to do this. I was so cheered up after Mark Blitz's talk that the words Donald Trump had not been mentioned. And when you started off, you seemed to suggest that you might continue in that tradition, but you let me down. So I thought this might be a Trump-free zone for 1 hour, but I don't intend to talk about him, actually, for the first hour of the last 18 months that I won't have. Just a couple of thoughts, because it's such a big topic, obviously. There's a line of Gladstone's I've always liked. I came across it somewhere. I think it was a speech he gave. This is William Ewart Gladstone, the great liberal prime minister of Great Britain in the late 19th century. And this is pretty late, I think, in his life. There's a attack, I think an early Irish terrorist, kind of Irish Republican attack somewhere, and the government's being slow in responding or ineffectual, perhaps, and someone says, this is just going to continue. We can't do much about this. And Gladstone says in some speech, I did not read the complete speeches of William Gladstone to discover this. I saw it cited somewhere, but I checked it, and it seems to be true. Gladstone said, the resources of civilization are not yet exhausted. And I kind of think the resources of liberal democracy are not yet exhausted, or not, let's just say, not exhausted, and less susceptible maybe to exhaustion than people tend to think. I'm sort of now in the mode of having spent a lot of my life and academic life and sort of in politics thinking about the limitations of liberal democracy and of liberal thought and of liberal practice, the ways in which it can, as Mark and Jim have both pointed out, it sort of can erode its own foundations or not restore itself sufficiently. I now think that's almost overdone in our common discourse, both academic and public, and liberalism is sort of underrated. It's underrated just, I think, for what it is. Liberal democracy is a pretty impressive regime, all things considered. It's become, when I grew up, when I was in college, there was late Tom Wolfe famously talked about radical chic, all these left-wingers who, it was easy and fashionable to condemn liberal democracy, democratic capitalism, and so forth, while enjoying its fruits. And this famous, fundraiser for the Black Panthers in Leonard Bernstein's apartment, I suppose, it was literally what Wolfe wrote about in the book, or the essay Radical Chic. We now have, that continues, of course, but we now have reactionary chic also, in my opinion. So in the old days, you read Gramsci, and it gave you a frisson of being superior to all these simple-minded liberals who just thought, what, we should have elections, we should have the Bill of Rights, we should respect other people, we should have a decent country, we should have more or less free markets with a safety net, and isn't that okay? And no, you don't understand anything about what's really happening, and read Gramsci and read Marcuse and stuff. Now it's sort of the opposite, right? Now you read Carl Schmitt, and it's very exciting. And now we have reactionary chic, tenured Harvard law professors who very much benefit from a society in which their rights are protected, and they have tenure at very fancy universities and so forth, really indulging in kind of not just critiques of liberal democracy, but contempt for liberal democracy. And one sees this. It's not a Trump phenomenon, I would say, though sometimes those people tend to be friendlier, obviously, to Donald Trump because they're less respectful of the norms and old-fashioned, sort of more simple processes and ways of behavior of a liberal democracy. But I think the critique's no truer than it was then. I mean, whatever the partial truth of the critique, the alternatives are never actually developed in any seriousness, or when they are, they turn out to be ghastly and intolerable, and in the real world, people see that this is not a desirable alternative. So it's too easy to sort of cherry-pick your cute little, Carl Schmittian insight that liberals don't understand how much politics is about friends and enemies, or your Gramscian insight, or Herbert Marcusean insight, or whatever, and not live with the consequences of taking that thinker's thought and then saying, okay, well, where does that lead? Are you really, and very few people who are, I think, or should be willing to defend that, though maybe, unfortunately, some more are willing to defend it than they were a few years ago. So there's too much easy disdain for liberalism, too much of a cartoonish view also of liberal. John Stuart Mill is now spoken of as if he was this ridiculously simple-minded guy who had nothing much to say except, my liberty stops where your, whatever wherever your face begins or whatever that is. As if Mill wasn't a very thoughtful liberal who was extremely concerned. What was On Liberty about, incidentally? It was about the threats to liberty from modern democracy and modern egalitarianism, and to some degree even modern capitalism and modern individualism. And it's not just threats to liberty, but threats to excellence. And who, incidentally, and Tocqueville is a little more respectable person to appeal to, and who wrote the great review of Tocqueville that made him well known first in the Anglo-American world, Mill. So people are just much too contemptuous, I think, of that kind of liberal tradition. Hayek, who I think is a less maybe subtle thinker than Mill in some ways, a 20th century libertarian. But if you actually look at the Constitution of Liberty, I haven't read the whole book in a long time, but if you look at it, it's quite sophisticated and well aware of all the problems of the liberal democracy and a liberal regime, capitalism can lead to. Schumpeter obviously thought a lot about this. Even John Dewey, who I would say maybe is a cut below Mill and Hayek. I read John Dewey in Mark Blitz's course. I think it was my first year at Harvard. It was a nice break from Heidegger. Not as deep as Heidegger, but a little easier. And I remember coming home, actually, not coming home, but coming to New York and seeing friends of my parents, actually, and saying I was reading Dewey, and I mean, that's such a simple-minded view of kind of progressive, liberalism of that era. And this friend, who was my parents' generation, said, we appreciated Dewey in 1940 when there were all these communist fellow travelers and all these fascist apologists. That's about, 3/4 of the intellectuals in the Western world fell into those two categories. And Dewey was simple-minded enough to say, you know what? Stalin is really bad news, and Hitler is really horrible, and we should fight for liberal democracy. And then he can go back to his, slightly maybe less than optimal understanding of the actual ground of it or of how we should fix our education system and so forth. So I just think people underrate liberals these days in that old-fashioned sense of liberals, and maybe if they went back and read them, they'd be more impressed. Too much disdain for liberals. There's also the more sophisticated kind of criticism, some of which, of course, is true, that, liberalism erodes its own, liberalism also can't function without enemies. It was one thing to have fascism in the 30s. That led to some greatness in terms of statesmanship, obviously Churchill, but Roosevelt, Truman even, and then communism then became the threat, and that led to some impressive achievements and sacrifices and focus on long-term efforts by liberal democracy. Most people will acknowledge that in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way up to Reagan. But now that we don't have those enemies, we're all falling apart, and it doesn't show a deep fundamental weakness of liberalism as a regime of liberal democracy. Well, a little bit, but it's true of every regime, right? I mean, obviously any regime is going to be strengthened by facing horrible enemies who clarify the choice. Any regime, after succeeding for a long time, is going to become complacent. Any nation, to be less fancy about it, any public is going to become more complacent, forgetful of what matters and what's necessary, why we make these sacrifices, what the alternative to the current liberal international order is, let's say, to take one obvious example that's in contention right now. Obviously, the duty of serious public leaders and politicians is to remind people of what the alternative is and to educate them some. But again, that's not a horrible problem of liberal democracy. It was a problem of any decent regime that's going to become a little more complacent, or it's going to not be able to be too decent. I guess Sparta might be the alternative. Maybe they kept going for longer, they were able to keep at that high pitch for longer, but they paid a price for that too. So I'm not, and incidentally, we do have plenty of enemies, and we will have plenty of enemies, I'm afraid. So if that's required to remind people of why they should be attached to liberal democracy, of a healthy kind of patriotism, I think that will not go away. There's the more sophisticated critique, and obviously Mark and Jim have touched on this, and this is partly true, that liberalism erodes its own foundations, or it depends on a moral foundation that it can't itself strengthen or replicate, I guess you'd say, or even preserve. I think that's partly true, but honestly a little bit overstated. I think if you look at the history of liberal thought and of liberal practice, it is able to revive itself. It is able to rethink things in new conditions and have a sort of new burst, if you will, of energy and of an understanding of what some of the dangers are, and a rebellion against those dangers, and a commitment to excellence and to true individuality as opposed to Tocquevillian individualism and to a kind of healthy patriotism. And one has seen that through the history of the U.S. and of other countries, and I would even say in liberal thought. Someone like Tocqueville, is actually ignored after the initial review by Mill and after the books were famous for a while in America. It's amazing how little he was read, then read by some academic sociologists for these insights he had, in the 1830s and so forth. But actually, I think, is taken much more seriously in the last 30, 40 years than he had been before that. And that's partly due to various actual thinkers who went back and revived the study of Tocqueville. I suppose Raymond Aron maybe in France, and then others here, obviously. And that's, there can be a genuine recapturing of these people's thought, and also it has to be, of course, updated to deal with, or recast to deal with modern contemporary challenges and new things and that he hadn't seen. But I think the ability of liberal democracy, both in theory and practice, to refresh itself is just underrated. I mean, the easier narrative is it's just sort of declining, and it's a question of what speed, and it's just eroding, and and there's so many eloquent statements of this by various Tories and older liberals and poets and Philip Larkin and everyone loves that. I mean, especially if you have a certain taste for a kind of conservatism, one likes that stuff, but it's not clear to me that it's actually a correct account. Intelligent liberals have been worried about the weaknesses of liberalism since the beginning of liberalism. That they've also understood every regime every political order has its weaknesses. It's not unique. Aristotle says they all degenerate, right? So it's not unique to the liberal order that it has certain tendencies of degeneration. I think actually you can make the case that the liberal order has more ability to resuscitate itself, to reinvigorate itself than a typical political order. But it does require thought, and it requires leadership. I just happened yesterday, I'll close with this, to take a look, well, in light of this news, Red Hat and everything else, Maxine Waters and Trump himself and Corey Lewandowski and God knows what, the just incredible decline of the discourse in the very short term and the real rabble-rousing that is, I think, quite dangerous. I was reminded of Lincoln's Lyceum speech, which January 1838, on the perpetuation of our political institutions, which calls attention to the alarming decline of respect for the law among his fellow citizens. And his account of it, I think, is interesting and sort of relevant. I mean, the kind of the passions that supported the regime, the memories of the fights, of the battles of the Revolution have gone. Those people have almost all died at that point in 1838. What's that, 62 years after 1776? And just as we have almost no living memory of World War II anymore, and we're gradually moving beyond living memory of the Cold War, and Lincoln has a very sophisticated discussion of this problem and challenge. He closes with this wonderful, we have to build on reason alone. That seems a little daunting to base a regime entirely on reason. But then he says in the very last sentence, I think, in this, let us revive our reverence for Washington or something. I mean, he has a very, Lincoln being Lincoln, he has a subtle understanding of reason and reverence, that it can't just be reason, it has to also be a certain kind of appreciation of our history and so forth. But this was a big problem of his in 1838, way back when. Now that maybe is not a good example to end on, because 20 years later, we had the Civil War, so that was, well, and that really, proved him right? So that was a real, but again, let's just say, let me end on that. I mean, we talk back, especially people in sort of my school of thinking about this, the founding, wonderful, and ever since downhill, really? I mean, the founding ended up in, if you want to think of it this way, 1861, because of the inability, or maybe that's even unfair, well, the inability, maybe they couldn't have dealt with the issue of slavery, but also because of a certain degeneration that they were unable to step up to at different times. So maybe that shows on the one hand that, yes, there was a tendency to decline from the founders to Jackson, and from Jackson to Stephen Douglas and popular sovereignty and the positive defense of slavery that people fell into because they wanted to. This reminds me a little bit of current events. They wanted to rationalize and defend something they really knew wasn't just, and it's very hard to rationalize something as a necessary injustice, so you end up embracing something that you started off just very reluctantly tolerating. But then we came out of that, and obviously there was a kind of reforming of the regime, and that's happened several times. So it's always a challenge. There's always the possibility, maybe the inevitability, of a kind of decline from whatever height one hits at rare moments. But it's not a new challenge. And it's not clear to me that it's a more severe challenge today than it was at many other points in American history and in Western history.
So I want to pick up on a point that Bill made. Bill, I was struck by the way you phrased this. You said, well, first off, the Gladstone quote, you said, or he said, resources of democracy are not yet civilization are not yet exhausted. But he didn't say that they're inexhaustible.
Right.
Right. And so I'm curious whether you think that's an important distinction or not. But then the other thing that you raised that I want to hone in on right away is when you said you pushed back against the idea that liberalism erodes its own foundations. And it reminds me of the book that your father's partner wrote, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, right, which is an argument very much in that vein. I'd be curious if you or anybody thinks that, what do you make of this point, the argument that these institutions in a way erode themselves, they don't replenish themselves? You said liberalism has a capability to refresh itself. Well, what you described might also be a capability to be refreshed, right? Whether it's being refreshed by a religious reawakening or an outside threat, this is very different, right? Liberalism being refreshed from outside forces or actually refreshing itself. And so I'm just curious, if you have any thoughts on that, or if anybody does.
Well, it's both. I mean, liberalism does have a tendency to erode itself, but it also has strong origins, and if one returns to those origins, that's a major way of attempting to prevent the erosion. In the long, long, long run, of course, however, everything concrete and practical will fade away. So one has that difficulty to contend with. But I think a serious return in one's thinking and teaching and acting to the real grounds of liberalism, that's a useful way to restore it. But one has to recognize that it has these tendencies in and of itself also to move in a certain direction away from what's best in it.
Jim, Bill?
Well, since Tocqueville was mentioned him again, he says that religion is the first institution of American politics, meaning that religion is fairly important, I guess. So, but you could say, this is a substantial change in American political system today. The decline across the board in religion, whereas many thought maybe in the 80s or 90s that we were heading away from Europe, it now seems that we're going in the direction of Europe, and the societies are more and more secular. So if religion was a source of restraint inside liberal democracy, what's going to take its place? Has reason, cold and hard reason, come up with some alternative that can perform the same function that religion did? That's one thing that concerns me. It's a pretty big thing, the absence of religion. So that would be the way I would approach it, that you have, as you suggest, you have a political system at certain points of view, but then you have these other parts of our tradition which maybe are allowed in liberalism, but are not encouraged by liberalism, and some of them seem to be in trouble. That leaves a lot of questions about the future.
I mean, since you mentioned Tocqueville, I mean, he in fact anticipates, he saw a decline of a certain kind of religious belief and anticipated, I would say, more of it. And he does have a substitute, I mean, a partial substitute, which is self-interest well understood. That's almost explicitly the way in which people extend their horizon, and the way, it's a belief. It's a little irrational, actually, he sort of implies, and therefore it almost has to be, people have to believe in this doctrine, which is supposedly rationalist. So it's a kind of religious belief in a rationalist doctrine, perhaps, that, it's really in our interest to take the long view, and so to speak, and not simply be driven by short-term pleasure and kind of hedonism and all that. And the same with replacing the institutions of an aristocratic society to deal with individualism. Whether we're at another stage where we need a new Tocqueville to think through in the current moment, what other substitutes are available, I'm a little less, I don't know, partly this is a 9/11 phenomenon for me. I suddenly got, after seeing real existing fanatic religion, if I can be honest about the implications of 9/11, I became a little friendlier to the early liberals and their sort of concern about that, and a little less indulgent in the notion that if only we were more religious, all would be well. I'm not saying that that's what you're saying, but so I think really thinking through in the model of Tocqueville, what is enlightened interest, how does one take people from the individual to the country in a healthy way, what is the right way to, I do think, in fact, the founders, let's just say after World War II, there was serious thought, okay, this is like a country that has not traditionally done much abroad. How are we going to prevent this from happening again? How do you give people a stake in the international world order? How do you make them take a little, see it's in their self-interest? How do you make them take a little pride in it? That's very conspicuous in the rhetoric, I would say, of Truman and of Eisenhower to some degree, Kennedy very much so, maybe a little overdone there. Certainly in Reagan, a mixture of, if we don't do this, we're gonna be in deep trouble. And this is a great thing that we have this opportunity to help not just defend ourselves, but help our allies defend themselves, and also spread liberal democracy where possible. I think there's too little, people have given up too much on the appeal to honor, something Tocqueville also discusses, and pride, and are a little too much, well, we can't do that because that's like, I don't know, old-fashioned or something. But an awful lot of people under Reagan and since 9/11 have been motivated by a sense of honor and pride, not narrow self-interest. So I'm a little more optimistic about the chances of, you can then have a fancy argument that honor and pride themselves aren't somehow consistent with liberalism, but that argument goes too far, right? So I think, it pushes too much in a sense. Yeah, no ultimate political doctrine can account for everything and take care of everything. But and also on religion, the opportunity liberal regimes provide just through simple free speech and free exercise, just to cite our own First Amendment, itself allows for religion to come back and allows for it also to come back in ways that might be more compatible with liberal democracy. So people talk about, well, there's the religion out here and there's liberalism here, and the religion's kind of eroded, and we just got to keep on going. But of course, it's precisely the institutions of liberalism that allow for possible reformulations of religious faith in ways that are compatible with the liberal order, but also might strengthen it anew.
Well, Mark, you were going to say?
I just wanted to say one thing about this. I don't know what the future of religion is going to be in the United States. But religious institutions also serve social functions and economic functions. And, if one could reduce a bit the importance of government and the strength of government, there's some chance that some of that slack will be taken up by strengthened social and perhaps religious institutions, something that one could do without magically trying to impose from above something that can't be imposed from above, genuine religion.
This summer is a good time to think about this, right? It's the 30th anniversary of George H.W. Bush's '88 convention speech, which was the 1,000 Points of Light speech, and it'd be you don't hear a speech like that right now. Maybe that's a shame. But separate from religion, Mark, you had talked about virtue. Virtue is one of your 10 points, and Madison wrote somewhere in the Federalist Bill, you can look it up, I'd probably get it wrong, maybe Federalist 55, where he says, Republican government presupposes these virtues more than any other form of government, more than monarchy, more than anything else. Republican government requires certain virtues. And so I'm curious, Mark and the others, to what extent did the framers really pin their hopes on the sustaining of virtue that would then be in turn necessary to sustain liberalism? And was that if did they pin too much hope on that?
Well, I would say that they certainly expected toleration. They certainly expected industriousness or hard work. And I think in time, what one expects is a kind of responsibility or self-reliance. There's a reduction in the full level of ancient pride or greatness of soul, perhaps. If you look at list of virtues in Aristotle's Ethics. Obviously, there's a diminution in a certain sense. But I think there is a reliance on the virtues I mentioned and also a certain kind of civility as well. So there's a democratization of the virtues, but still I think at a high level, which is extremely important. I don't see any reason to think that that's gone by the wayside permanently. It needs to be taught. One needs to be habituated. It doesn't come automatically. Those are the things that one worries about. But it's also not the case that it's disappeared forever, or even in certain ways has disappeared very much. So I think it is important to see that a certain kind of character is necessary in order to successfully assert one's own rights. That's, I think, the heart of the matter. That's central, I think.
Anybody else?
Just that, to remind people that what you get in the Federalist Papers is only a small part of American government at the time it was formed. That all these concerns about character and virtue, which aren't much discussed in the Federalist Papers, were to be in the provinces of the states. And so therefore, to kind of understand fully the American polity at the beginning, you have to look at the thought that went into the various state governments and how much these things were discussed in different ways in different states, but altogether discussed an awful lot. Beginning with education, it's one thing, how important education would be, how important religion would be, how important various other aspects of society would be. That's the place to look to see what was seriously intended for how character would be formed.
I would just say everyone should look actually at Mark Blitz. After you buy Harvey Mansfield's 40-year-old book on liberalism, you should buy Mark Blitz's 13-year-old book on liberalism as well, really, Duty Bound, which really is a serious attempt to think through the virtues from the point of view of, or from in the horizon of, maybe, I guess I would say, liberalism and the liberal regime. But I mean, this is at some point an empirical question. I mean, right? I mean, it's not. We can have a theory that everything is decline. I'm not so sure that there's been so much decline. I mean, really, if Aristotle came down from Mars, wherever Aristotle would be hanging out these days, and looked at the baby boomers, just empirically at what they have done in terms of civic participation, family structure, sacrifice for the country, et cetera, and then look, let's say, at the millennials, which is obviously now a very incomplete roster. I'm not so sure that the millennials don't stack up as a little more responsible, a little more forward-looking, a little more thinking about a kind of somewhat longer view of their own self-interest and so forth. Maybe some appreciation, even a really higher of excellence. It's like I mean, who knows? But I just think we're too quick to assume that, we take the best instance of something we liked in the past. I think that's the way everyone was back then, and then we take sort of the worst aspect of contemporary America and say, boy, what a decline. But that's not exactly fair, Or the young people who fought, just to take an obvious example, since 9/11, I mean, less impressive than the young people of the 80s or 90s, or the young people of the late 60s and 70s. Now, there are many others. It's complicated, but I think one has to be a little bit more open to being surprised that there are these things go up and down, and there are things that stimulate fresh thinking, I would say, fresh understanding. I was thinking about talking about business, too. I mean, there's a kind of corporate responsibility from the 50s and 60s that I think is missed, and that was a kind of civic leadership that maybe doesn't exist quite as much. On the other hand, it's very impressive the last 15 years in terms of enterprise, innovation, entrepreneurship. Those are kinds of aspects of virtues, you might say, or qualities that are desirable in a vigorous free society. And there's a lot more of that, I would say, out in California in the last 20 years, maybe than there was in the, 50s and 60s when people were chugging along and in big corporations and so forth. So it is more complicated, I think, than the normal account.
Jim, you mentioned federalism. I'm curious. The framers, obviously, they structured our government by separating the three powers at the federal level and then dividing power between the federal and state governments. Does liberalism, or the maintenance of liberalism, identify more with one branch of government than others, or does it identify more with the dispersion of power among the states than it does with the federal level, or is it all just contribute equally to the maintenance of liberalism?
Well, in our liberalism, I think the critical thing is division of powers altogether, vertically and horizontally. So federalism is the division of powers one way between the center and its constituent elements, and separation of powers is division of power at the national level. A very strong emphasis. I mean, everyone knows this is characteristic of our government, that power should somehow be checked and found to be checked, whereas in other systems, the idea of liberal democracy is to put power in one place, let it govern for a while, and then overturn it if you don't like it. So those are two distinctive ways of looking at political systems of the West. I think the progressives, to go back to the earlier point, were much more on the view of concentrating power and allowing it to govern. I think probably with the idea that you need more state action, and state action is more likely to occur when you concentrate power than when it's divided. Yeah. And the original American system was much more on the side of dividing power.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I'm saying is, the courts are there, in theory, to protect rights. Congress is there to be sort of a give and take and compromise. But then, of course, the executive, I mean, sure, the progressives liked an energetic executive, and so did Hamilton, and he said an energetic executive is a leading character for good government at home, no less than abroad. If you had to put your sort of faith in one of those branches to take the lead in refreshing liberalism, is there one to pick?
Depends who's president.
Fair enough.
Practically speaking, any change, it would probably have to come from the executive.
Yeah.
There's only one person in Congress who really made a significant change of the system in the last 100 years. That's Newt Gingrich. I don't know what you think about that one way or the other, but he's the one that disproved every textbook in existence, which said there's no possibility of leadership in the Congress, and he did it for about 8 months, which was a real accomplishment. It wasn't long-lived. It's hard to believe in the modern age that this could come any place except from the president. So keep your fingers crossed.
Phil?
I mean, I was thinking about this conversation and the appeals to the founders in the casual way. You quote the Federalist, and we mentioned Tocqueville.
Maybe too casual.
No, but that would not have happened 50 years ago in a conversation. I mean, the Federalist was viewed as, a kind of class instrument of the property holders. The Marxist critique was dominant. No one read the book seriously. You read Federalist 10 in classes and Federalist 51, I suppose, and a couple of Federalist 78 to see judicial review. The idea that one would actually learn lessons from Madison, that was not the America of Charles Beard and of most of those historians. Even the conservative historians of the day and the conservative thinkers of the day were more enamored of British and continental conservatism. The notion that you could go back and really learn. So why did that happen? That happened because of very specific academics who rediscovered, I think mostly, who rediscovered the founders themselves under the influence of other professors who weren't primarily concerned with America, but who taught people not to read everything in a progressive or historicist way. Those thinkers, some of the most famous of them, came here because we actually were a liberal regime, and they had to flee illiberal regimes. And we also had a reasonable immigration policy, if I could point out, that welcomed a fair number of people in, or at least there were other liberal countries that took some of them. And we have a much different understanding of the founders. It's really amazing how that's then percolated out, I would say. So then you got the whole wave of biographies of the founders being quite popular, and this, I guess, culminates in Hamilton, the musical, which, you have to be sort of old enough to remember that Hamilton was a bogeyman. He was a terrible, aristocrat, monarchist. And that's not just that's not just due to 20th century progressivism, a great itself boogeyman of some of our friends, not that I'm a fan of it, but that was already the case when Hamilton's papers get, was it Roosevelt or Lodge, I guess, right, does the kind of modern edition, before the really modern edition, of Hamilton's papers in, 1900 or something like that. And that's because he has been totally persona non grata for a long time, because you couldn't be a Hamiltonian because that was undemocratic and et cetera. And everyone had to appeal to Jefferson, even if you weren't from the Jeffersonian Party, et cetera. So there were very self-conscious efforts at different times to revive and resuscitate traditions, to modernize them if necessary, in ways that actually worked. I mean, so if we were sitting here and no one could cite the Federalist and no one could cite Tocqueville, it wasn't respectable to teach them, and it wasn't, et cetera, that I would be really think, yeah, this thing just slides downhill. It's just, you start here and then everyone forgets everything, and an idiotic progressivism and historicism and relativism takes over, and then you just end up in the pit. But that's really not the story, at least of American intellectual history, I would say, and for all the problems of the academy. I mean, obviously that's terrible, but then the popular culture weirdly sometimes turns out to be a little healthier than the academy, or a little more receptive to these lessons. So that's just one of a million instances one could cite where the ability to refound, the ability to revive, the ability to not just refound, but sort of found anew is greater than people think. And it's easy, but it can be done within the context of the liberal regime, which is a huge advantage of liberalism.
Mark?
I don't think any of that is primarily political, so that though it is important to look at the political institutions, and maybe for the issues you're talking about, the presidency, but also the courts, more fundamental, I think, still, if one is concerned about education, if one is concerned about character, if one is concerned about the virtues of entrepreneurship and so on, is what happens in the country as a whole. It's, I think, not a good thing if one expects reform or revival to be primarily something which is led by government. It's significant, obviously, what happens, but it's not the heart of the matter. So the balance between the federal government and the states, I think, is less important than real regeneration, intelligence, excellence in the country as a whole.
Is that why the fights over our universities and immigration policy in particular are so heated? Because those two debates are so much the seedbed of the next generation of liberalism, or the next generation of culture in America in general. I mean, you can debate education or immigration in terms of jobs or the economy or whatever, but at root they both are fundamental debates over what the country is, who we are, and who the country will be when we're gone.
What the way of life will be.
Yeah.
But just on immigration, I mean, that cuts so much more. It cuts both ways, in a way that the discussion of immigration regards it as entirely we Americans, we're preserving that heritage wonderfully, and these immigrants, it's a real risk, because what do they know about any of this stuff? But the truth is, as American history has suggested, the immigrants are the ones who often appreciate liberty more than the third, fourth, fifth generation of people who've taken it for granted. I gave a talk, I was on a panel like this actually at Yale about 3 months ago. I guess we were there together, right? And a very good panel, and sort of similar topic, I'd say. And a smart undergraduate from the stood up and asked a question. And it was, Mr. Kristol, you've tried to give some sort of defense of liberal democracy, democratic norms, procedures, the rule of law, but let's face it, that stuff's just boring. And it doesn't answer my existential questions about life, and we need a politics that is more responsive to that. And I tried to give an answer, not a very good one, about, well, be careful what you wish for, and that's easy for you to say, but do you really mean that? And are you even so sure that it's so much deeper to go blithering on about existential angst and all this than to actually think through, what a liberal order requires? But when I finished, another student sort of stood up from the audience, quite agitated, didn't even wait to be kind of called on, and he had an accent, and he said, look, I came from an illiberal society. And let me tell you why your easy disdain for just basic freedoms is really ridiculous. And he gave a wonderful answer, and it may be even more pro-immigration than but you think of the history of America, a lot of the greatest people who've understood liberal democracy the best, and certainly those who've fought for it the most, have been people who've come here, which is another advantage of being a liberal regime. People do tend to want to come to it, not flee from it.
Mark, since you began this all with a list of 10 points, I just can't help but ask, were they in rank order? Is there one above all the others that you think is most important?
I leave it to you to figure that out. But no, always the single most important basis of the country is equal natural rights, the Declaration of Independence, the true founding document of the country. So that would be number one. Right. Not number one in the list in the order, but number one.
It was number 5, and it's just where the book fell open.
It was number 2. Equal natural rights, number 2, because I wanted to start with the Greeks for the reasons I gave. Right. Equal natural rights, because that's the basis of equality. It's the basis of liberty, and it's a basis which it exists in reason and can be reasonably understood. Hence, universal among human beings. I think it's the central element.
Well, what better note to end on? Let everybody join me in thanking our speakers.